Good afternoon, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. This is Rich again, back for your second video blog of the day for Wednesday, April 15th, 2015, around 5:24 p.m. in Billerica, Massachusetts. Another nice, beautiful day, highs in the 70s. Some news to report. Aaron Hernandez, former New England Patriots tight end, has been guilty of murder one. He's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. The Boston Bruins have announced they have fired Peter Chiarelli as general manager because the Bruins did not make the playoffs, and it looks like Claude Julien could be following him out the door onto the unemployment line. And Washington Nationals beat the Boston Red Sox by the score of 10-5 to avoid a 3-game sweep. And that's about it on the news. My next subject is about one of the most famous professional wrestling feuds of all time. This feud is Jerry the King Lawler, one of the most legendary wrestlers from Memphis, Tennessee, against actor, comedian Andy Kaufman. This feud was in the CWA for about a year and a half, from 1982 to 1983. It was one of the best feuds of all time. It didn't get too much mainstream publicity because wrestling was still in the regional territories, and this was not on cable television and stuff like that. If it was, it probably would go down as one of the most famous feuds of all time, but it's one of the most famous feuds in the CWA, but in professional wrestling probably doesn't rank up there. The background of the story of the feud between Jerry the King Lawler and Andy Kaufman. Andy Kaufman was an actor comedian. He was known for his role on Taxi as Lacgus, and he was also played Tony Clifton at times. And one of his comedy acts, Andy Kaufman would wrestle girls in some of his comedy acts. And he got the attention of professional wrestling writer Bill Apter, and he talked to Bill Apter. He said to Bill Apter, I want to do this in the WWF, wrestle females. And Bill Apter told him to see Vince McMahon Sr., but Vince McMahon Sr. says he was not interested in having intergender matches. If it was Vince McMahon Jr. running the WWE around that time, it would have been okay. Then Bill Apter told him there's a guy in Memphis, Tennessee by the name of Jerry Jarrett, and he might like this. And then Andy met Jerry Jarrett, and then they started the Intergender Champion with Andy Kaufman. He was wrestling girls. Some of them were very skinny and stuff. He was beating them very easily. Then one time there was a lady named Foxy Brown, and Foxy Brown was a big woman, and she gave Andy a run for his money for the Intergender Championship. And then one time Foxy Brown had Jerry the King Lawler in her corner, and Andy barely beat Foxy Brown, but afterwards attacking her. And then Lawler shoves Kaufman, and Kaufman gets mad. He says, I'll sue Lawler, I'll sue Lawler, I'll sue Lawler. And then this starts an angle with some of the greatest heel work by Andy Kaufman. And Jerry the King Lawler was very serious at this time. And then Andy Kaufman says, oh, man, see, you hook on over, see, you see, Mr. Lawler, I'm from Hollywood and stuff like that. He would go on. He sounded like a professional wrestling heel and stuff. And these promos were very good. And it eventually ended at a match in April of 1982 at the Mid-South Coliseum between Jerry the King Lawler and Andy Kaufman. And this match was, so much stalling. It only was about 6 minutes, only 2 moves. Lawler puts Kaufman in the pile driver, which was an illegal move for many years in Tennessee. Lawler gets himself disqualified. Andy Kaufman's gets carried off away. He has a neck brace. And then a few weeks later on Saturday Night Live, Andy Kaufman apologizes to Jerry the King Lawler in his neck brace. But in June of 1982, Andy Kaufman and Jerry the King Lawler were on the late night with David Letterman as guests, and Lawler and Kauffman were like arguing and stuff like that during the commercial break. Lawler punches out Kauffman, and then Andy Kauffman threatens to sue NBC and stuff, and he says he would turn it to a wrestling channel, and then NBC countersued Andy Kauffman back and stuff. But in real life, this was work. This was a work because wrestling's a work and stuff like that, professional wrestling. A few months later, Andy Kauffman returns to the CWA in Memphis, Tennessee to have a long-running feud with Jerry the King Lawler. And guess who Andy Kauffman had in his corner? Longtime rival of Jerry the King Lawler, Jimmy the Mouth of the South Hart. And this feud lasted well over several months. Andy Kauffman one time cost Jerry the King Lawler a chance to win the AWA World title against Nick Bockwinkel at the Mid-South Coliseum. And then they had several matches on Monday nights, which was a lot of stalling and stuff like that, a lot of comedy moves by Andy Kauffman. Sometimes Andy Kauffman would wound up like this, wound up like that, and he would go to the mic, I'm the King, I'm the King, I'm the new King of Memphis, Tennessee, I'm gonna knock that Lawler out last week, I'm gonna knock him out again. And Lance Russell on commentaries was saying when he was rounding up, he would do that every single night. And Lance Russell, with like the commentary on the Lawler-Kauffman feud, was outstanding. Probably classic and stuff like that. And then Kauffman continues to feud with Lawler, and then they slap and stuff like that. One time on Memphis Television, a television show from WMC Channel 5, in the studio show, Lawler sneaks up behind Kauffman and throws a fireball at him, and this feud's getting real personal and stuff like that. And then one time there was a handicap match between Jerry the King Lawler and Andy Kauffman and Jimmy Hart, and then there was tension between Kauffman and Hart, like Hart throws Kauffman into Jerry the King Lawler. Jerry the King Lawler gives him the pile drive, gets himself disqualified. And then the next week on Memphis Television show, Andy Kauffman and Jimmy Hart get mad and stuff, and they argue and stuff like that. And it's bedlam. They were shouting matches, that stuff like that. And Andy Kauffman at the end says, "I'll sue you, Russell. I'll sue all of you," and stuff like that. That's what getting now a match between Jimmy Hart and Andy Kauffman. And then they had the next Monday night, they have Andy Kauffman wrestle against Jimmy Hart, and then it was a comedy match. But one of Jimmy Hart's goons, Sweet Daddy-O, attacks Andy Kauffman, stuff like that. And then nobody rescues Andy Kauffman. The next week on Memphis Television, Andy Kauffman says he had a check for $10,000. Originally, he was going to deliver that check to like any wrestler to put Jerry the King Lawler out of professional wrestling for good. Then he asked Jerry the King Lawler to say something. He wanted a partner because for Jimmy Hart and one of his goons against Andy Kauffman and Jerry the King Lawler. Jerry the King Lawler said, like, you've been doing your mouth about I want Lawler out, and Jerry the King Lawler agreed to tag with Andy Kauffman under one condition, that it's the last time Andy Kauffman is ever in a professional wrestling ring. Andy Kauffman agreed to that, and then it was Andy Kauffman and Jerry the King Lawler against Jimmy Hart and one of the Assassins. Don't know if it was the Jody Hamilton or somebody else. It could have been, but who knows? And then they have the Assassin and Jimmy Hart against Jerry the King Lawler and Andy Kauffman at the Mid-South Coliseum. And then it was Lawler like hooking it up with the Assassin, and then Andy Kauffman holds his hand and comes into the ring and throws powder on Jerry the King Lawler. And then Lance Russell on commentator says, "Look, Kauffman turns on Lawler. This was all I put on just to get Jerry the King Lawler in the ring." And then Hart and it's disqualified. And then Hart and Kauffman and the Assassins attack Jerry the King Lawler, and they deliver a spike pile driver, and the fans were booing Andy Kauffman like crazy. This was a put on and stuff like that. Lawler was taken out on a stretcher, and then the next week on Memphis Television, they had Andy Kaufman wearing the King's crown says, "I told you, Lawler, I told you you'll be out of professional wrestling, and I said I'm the new King of Memphis, Tennessee," and stuff like that. This feud goes on a few more months, but eventually it ends when Andy Kaufman has cancer and he passes away in 1984. And this feud doesn't have a conclusion to it, but this feud was documented on a show called Andy Kaufman, I'm from Hollywood, in the late 1980s. That feud was documented. It's been reran several times on Comedy Central. I thought this feud between Andy Kaufman and Jerry the King Lawler was fantastic. One of the best feuds of professional wrestling history of all time. And it would have been mainstream publicity if this feud was a few years later, because that's when the big wrestling boom hit. And this got a lot of attention to the CWA and stuff like that. And it was kind of ahead of its time, having a celebrity involved in professional wrestling. It was a little ahead of its time, and it was good. Jerry the King Lawler was awesome in this feud. The commentary of Lance Russell, outstanding. It's probably one of the outstanding things that Lance Russell's done, with the commentary between Jerry the King Lawler and Andy Kaufman. He has a disdain for Kaufman, Lance Russell. And that's about it on this feud, Jerry the King Lawler and Andy Kaufman. Well, I'll be back for the third and final video blog of the night, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, which will be about the personality profile, Joe Sackett, longtime captain of the Nordiques, and Avalanche, two-time Stanley Cup winner. And the next 5 video blog personality profiles will be Stanley Cup captain champions Steve Eisenman, Scott Stevens, Mario Lemieux, and Lanny McDonald. Have a good day, Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. Bye.